Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Scott. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I think among the very flattering list of accolades that Scott listed off, one that I'm particularly proud of is having served as Scott's own PhD advisor when he was a student at the University of Wisconsin, and working very closely with a number of researchers in SAGE, which is our Center for Sustainability and the Global Environment, which is part of our parent institution, the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies. And my own research is quite similar to that of Scott's and a lot of the work going on at Seeger here at the University of Iowa, dealing with computer modeling of air quality and links with public health and decision making. But I'm speaking today more with my hat on as the director of this interdisciplinary research center. It was about 30 people when Scott graduated just 2 years ago. We've actually been growing very rapidly, and I think now we're at about 65 people with 7 professors and their associated research teams. So what I'm presenting here is sort of what I've been thinking about, because so many people say, what does sustainability mean in a university context, in a Midwestern context, in a national and international dialogue. And I've also started teaching a class just this past semester called Introduction to Sustainability Science. And so thinking about these connections and what does this word really mean that we hear bantered about all the time. So from my perspective, what it really means is how we're addressing this grand challenge. How do we ensure a high quality of life for a very rapidly growing population with a stable climate, healthy air, drinkable water, available food, and all the other ingredients that we as humans deem as essential or highly desirable for life on our planet. So breaking down this big challenge into individual issues is the only way that we're going to start tackling these problems. And so this is the sort of laundry list of issues that might come to mind when you start thinking about sustainability: human health and well-being, biological systems, air, clean air, visible air, air that helps crops and ecosystems thrive, access to food at a reasonable cost and a nutritional value, water, having it available, clean, affordable, have land for conservation, farming, and for us to be living, and have a stable climate. Something where we can make infrastructure investments, build our energy systems, grow crops with some idea of what the right planting date is and how high a dam should be built or how high a bridge should be built to avoid flooding or other disasters. So there's all these individual issues, and they're all being studied, and they've been studied for a very long time in traditional departments. Civil and environmental engineering has a strong tradition of hydrology in the water realm, or departments of agronomy and the food and agricultural land issues, or Department of Atmospheric Science at some universities around climate change. But where these individual issues start becoming something bigger than the parts is really, I think, where the term sustainability takes shape. And I'll just start, I could have started with any one of these, or the many things that are probably left off of this chart, but I'll just start with water just to get the conversation going. And you might think, well, what actually impacts whether we have available, clean, affordable water? And one thing is the land. How are we using the land where the water is flowing and the glaciers that are melting and the fertilizers that are running into the water? What is the climate? Where is there precipitation? How dry is it? What are evaporation rates? Is the rain and the snow coming in regular, moderate patterns, or is it going to flood on a more frequent basis? What are the biological systems affecting our waterways? In Madison, Wisconsin, we have 3 big lakes, and the biggest is Lake Mendota. And in Lake Mendota, actually, there's so much algae that's growing in the lakes that it can become unsafe to swim. So biological systems are affecting water, air. Often there are acid deposition issues coming from acidifying species in the atmosphere, or other contaminants that are transferred, like mercury, to the water through the air. So we can't just look at water without looking at it in this connected way. And on the flip side, water itself affects human health, affects food access, cost, and quality, affects the land where it's flowing. Water affects the climate patterns of it, where lakes and streams and glaciers are accumulating. It affects the biological systems that are connected to it. So these interconnections between what may have traditionally been viewed as separate issues or disciplinary issues, this, from an academic perspective, is, I think, where sustainability comes into play. And I know that a big theme through this lecture series has been history, and Scott was asking me to comment on the history of sustainability as an idea. And I'm not a historian, so this is a very non-nuanced comment, but really I would say around 2000, there was this huge explosion, especially around the idea of sustainability science. There was an article published in the journal Science by Bill Clark and colleagues at Harvard who posited that this broader area of sustainability studies, sustainability science, is something that is not being addressed if you look at things on a case-by-case, discipline-by-discipline basis. That was actually right around the time that our center, SAGE, got founded. And in going through some old documents, I discovered that its initial name was supposed to be the Center for Sustainability Science, which would have been founded right around the same time that that article came out. So this idea that sustainability as a term that you may hear all over the place now, and you didn't even 5 years ago, it's not just your perception, it really is a new approach. I would also argue that it's gained some traction in part because it's not as value-laden as some of the other terms that are often used to describe environmental issues, because economics are part of a sustainable system. Human energy use is part of a sustainable system. Food production is part of a sustainable system. So if you say I want to have sustainable food production, it does not necessarily argue for one particular course of action, but more thinking about how all these integrated parts link together. And so I think it can get a little bit more buy-in from different stakeholders who are affected. So this is just a snapshot of what our website looks like for our research center and how we've sliced and diced it. This is really mostly based on the researchers who are at our center. But whatever your sustainability issue, there's different, or whatever the issue that you're connecting with sustainability, there are a lot of different ways to cut the pie. And I'm just going to carry this idea further that more and more issues cut across multiple individual environmental aspects, public health aspects, and just a few of the issues that are increasingly being talked about from a sustainability perspective. Transportation. Where is the transportation? How is it affecting land use, emissions, greenhouse gases and climate, public health, whether from safety or from exposure to nearby pollutants? Agriculture, cutting across food, water, air, climate, electricity production, biodiversity, urban development, deforestation. The list could go on and on. But there's more and more issues that if you try to think what one department would be best suited to address this, or what one division of the federal government would be best suited to address this, you really can't come up with a one-line answer. So what does this mean for the Midwest? And I changed the title of this talk just by one word. I noticed it as I was walking in that as I'd been thinking about this, it's really, in my view, sustainability and the Midwest as opposed to sustainability in the Midwest. Because when thinking about what does sustainability mean, and as Scott alluded to it, that we have these planetary boundaries. We have one planet and a population that is about triple what it was in the 1950s. And so as that growing population eats better, lives longer, has a higher quality of living, do we have the resources to be meeting those demands? And the short answer is no, not if the rest of the world is migrating to live at a standard typical of life here in Iowa City. In fact, quite often if you do some of these ecological footprint calculations, it comes out that it would take something like 6 to 8 Earths to support the whole population living the way that we do now. So it is physically impossible for us to be having beautiful university rooms powered by coal-fired electricity and us to be eating cheeseburgers for dinner for every single person in the world. Just can't, it's not going to happen. So taking these big global issues and connecting them with our issues here in the Midwest, to me the key issues are there, what are the vulnerabilities, what are the opportunities, and are there some unexpected linkages, so that as we're making decisions around energy, around forest resources, around food production, are we making sure that we're seeing the big picture, that we're not just having blinders on because we're only talking about air? And I'm going to explore these issues through 2 case studies. And I'm happy in the question and answer period to go into more detail on this, to talk more about air pollution or electricity production or anything else. But I think that having some concrete examples is a nice place to base the discussion. And the first study I'm going to talk about is climate change, because here we have a global issue that is affecting the Midwest, and it's affecting the Midwest in some fairly unique ways. And I'll give you a teaser that my second case study is biofuels, because I think biofuels are an area where the Midwest is affecting the globe in some fairly unique ways. So there could be a lot of other examples to explore, but we only have an hour. We'll dig into these quite interesting topics. So first of all, just to start with the very basics on climate change, this is probably review for many of you, but since this is a policy class and not an atmospheric science class, I just want to make sure that we have all the right language to get going with our thinking about climate change. That the basic explanation of why we're concerned with climate change is because of this layer of greenhouse gases that intercept cooling radiation coming off of the Earth. That's the red outbound arrow. And this cooling radiation is absorbed by certain gases in the atmosphere. Not every gas. In fact, most of the atmosphere is made up of diatomic nitrogen, N2, and diatomic oxygen, O2, and neither of those absorb outgoing long-wave radiation. So it's not all gases that play this special role. And so that's why the gases that absorb this outgoing radiation from the Earth are called greenhouse gases. And so among greenhouse gases are carbon dioxide, which you've certainly heard of in this context, as well as methane, nitrous oxide, N2O, a range of industrial chemicals, ozone, a number of different gases that play this warming role. And these gases have been around for a very, very long time. And in fact, if it hadn't been for natural levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere of about 280 parts per million, then it's questionable whether the Earth would have ever even been habitable. So it's good that these greenhouse gases warm the atmosphere. That's really not debated. And it has to do with very specific characteristics of how the molecules in carbon dioxide are bonded together, or in methane, and how they absorb radiation. So this is not a controversial part of the global warming story. It's also not controversial that carbon dioxide has been increasing in the atmosphere. We can measure it. The longest data set goes back to 1957 or 1958, taken at Hawaii. And we can see every year the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is going up and up and up. And here it starts at about 315, but that's because by then it was already the 1950s. The typical value that's used for these pre-industrial, before the Industrial Revolution, natural values is about 280. It's going up, but it has this little zigzag in it, and that's because as plants grow, they absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and then as they decay or are burned, they release that carbon dioxide back to the atmosphere. And since there's most of the land cover in the northern hemisphere, and Hawaii is also in the northern hemisphere, the zigzag follows the northern hemisphere seasons. So during the springtime, all the plants are growing and sucking the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and then in the fall and winter, they release it back to the atmosphere. So that's the zigzag of the seasons on top of this very steady growth. So we know that carbon dioxide warms the atmosphere. We know that its levels are rising in the atmosphere, and it stays in the atmosphere for about 200 years or more. So because it's staying in the atmosphere for centuries, this carbon dioxide mixes all across the globe. So whether you're emitting carbon dioxide here in Iowa or in India or in Siberia, it's all staying in the atmosphere and affecting the climate across the globe. And so that's why when people talk about global climate change, it really is a global issue. And it's the sum of the decisions and actions and policies and energy use of everybody on Earth. But no one person can say that I'm just going to change my actions and have a different climate. This is a global issue. I'm also setting the stage here for a discussion about biofuels, because I think you'll see more clearly why there's some interest in biofuels when understanding this, the role of plants in this climate system. And so here in the upper right corner is this very standard metaphor for thinking about carbon in the atmosphere, which is a bathtub. And that every year there's about 7 billion tons of carbon emitted into the atmosphere from fossil fuel burning. That's coal from electricity use, and oil from transportation, and natural gas from home heating, and a wide range of other sources. And then there are two drains for this bathtub. And one is uptake by the oceans, and the other is uptake by the land, both plants directly and also soils, carbon that's stored in the soils. So if you want to be thinking about how to reduce the carbon in the atmosphere, we really have two levers. We can reduce what's coming in the spigot, or we can reduce what's going out the drain. These are some very classic, widely cited figures. These are from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report that came out in 2007. A newer report is already in the works. But basically, if you look over the past 150 years, we can see the evidence of this increasing carbon dioxide in the climate. The top graph shows global mean temperatures, which go up and down, especially related to volcanic activity, but then over the past 50 years have been climbing steadily. Global average sea level has been climbing, and northern hemisphere snow cover has been going down, but again, that jumps around from year to year. The left panel is just zooming in on those carbon dioxide increases that I showed you measured at Mauna Loa. Now these are going back 10,000 years using data from ice cores. And so we see that increase that we saw here in Hawaii, if we compress it, that increase is that hockey stick at the far right side of the top panel. And we see this clear spike in atmospheric concentrations, not just of carbon dioxide, but of the other greenhouse gases as well. So you often hear numbers just like I'm throwing out here: global average numbers, annual average numbers. And that's because that's much easier to synthesize in a single plot like this. But I think it's worth pausing now for a minute and harking back to your statistics class and thinking about means versus distribution. And what I've been showing here, these are mean values of climate. Global mean, annual average, sometimes multiple year averages. And so if we think about here a typical June in Wisconsin, here in Iowa it's probably a little bit warmer, but a typical June in Wisconsin has a mean temperature of about 70 degrees Fahrenheit. But it's not unthinkable to have a day that's below freezing in even in June, about 30 degrees. And it's not unthinkable to have a day about 100 degrees, very hot for a Wisconsin June. So we all know that even though we have a mean value, we have a distribution around those means. So when we're talking about a change in these mean values, whether it's a global mean or an annual mean, what that's really meaning is that the distribution is shifting. And often the distribution is also changing shape. But here I'll just talk about the shift. So what that means is if we think about June in Wisconsin, that now, whereas it would have been considered crazy hot to have a 100-degree day, now that might be not so unusual. And now a 110-degree day would be a lot more unusual. And whereas before we might have from time to time have seen a really cold day below freezing, even a small shift in the overall distribution can greatly reduce the odds of some of those extreme events. So this way of thinking about the changing climate is really linking climate back to weather. And weather is what is affecting each of us on our day-to-day lives, and weather is what is driving most sustainability issues and policy issues here in the Midwest. Here in Iowa City, of course, there were those extreme rain in 2008 causing massive flooding. That was the tail of the distribution. Now, you can't say that that particular rainfall was due to global warming, but you can be looking at the distribution and you can be saying, is it changing? What are our betting odds for extreme rainfall like we saw in 2008? So this is actually showing data back to 1958 and saying that actually we are seeing increases in that very heavy precipitation. And here in the Midwest, we are especially affected by it. We've seen a 31% increase in extreme precipitation just since between 1958 and 2007. Amazingly, the Northeast has seen even a worse increase of a 67% increase in these very heavy precipitation. And we've also seen trends, not just an annual average, but we can look at season by season. And here in the upper Midwest, we've seen winter temperatures just since 1975 increase an average of 6 to 7 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's a pretty notable change when you're thinking about thawing dates and planting dates, and even whether you need to buy long underwear for the season or whether you can get by without it. So these historic changes are clearly showing an impact here for the Midwest. And our infrastructure here, we have a lot of electricity production in the Midwest, and we have a lot of freight transport, a lot of major big cities, a lot of agriculture, a lot of systems that depend on having a stable climate and suffer when there is extreme weather. And what you're seeing here, both of these figures are from the climate change assessment for the United States that was released in 2009, and showing weather-related disturbances to the electricity grid. And we see that just since 1992, the weather-related disturbances across the United States have gone up. Here in 2008, they were dominated by thunderstorms and windstorms and some wildfires that are getting larger as well. So one issue that is just, are we going to see more blackouts? What's our risk? How do we need to be building infrastructure to be more robust? We can look, too, at agriculture, and this is probably a familiar type of graph showing yield in bushels per acre going up consistently since the 1960s. But if you look at the years in the U.S. where corn yields really dropped, they were years that had extreme weather, whether it's floods, droughts, or other unusual climate events. So we might look to the future and say, well, what does the future hold for the Midwest? And this is there's been a lot of summary reports, and I could point you toward a lot of different resources if you're interested in looking further at this, but I'll just focus on this extreme heat as one metric. And these estimates are taken from global climate models, so they're not perfect, And in fact, you can take here in the upper right-hand corner, this is the recent past from about the 1960s. And if you compare that with the end of the 21st century, you can think of an optimist view in the middle panel and a pessimist view in the lower panel, that this is the question of how many days are going to be above 90 degrees. And here in Iowa, we're hovering around 15 days per year are typically above 90 degrees Fahrenheit. But as you move forward, whether you're thinking about the optimist or the pessimist, you're getting up between around 60 and 90 days per summer. So that's a huge fraction of the summer season above 90 degrees. And when you think about what is how those tails of the distribution are becoming more common, this is looking at what might be considered a 1 in 20 year event, like the hottest heat wave that you can remember in your whole life, for those of you who are around 25, or in the past 20 years for the rest of us, that how often would those super duper hot heat waves be appearing? And what it's finding is that across most of the U.S., we're seeing that hottest heat wave that you can ever even remember happening about every 2 to 3 years. So whether you're thinking about what we've already seen or what are some of the projected changes, there's clear global impacts here on the Midwest. Another impact here, and I think I'll just allude to this briefly, is that, in a lot of cities in the United States, air pollution is a major issue, and actually across a lot of regional areas as well. And if we look at Chicago, some of you may be from Chicago, that's where I grew up, and we see that historically, this upper left panel is temperature. On hotter days, we get more ozone smog. The lower panel is sunlight. On sunnier days, we get more ozone as well. And so if we say, okay, well, let's just project these trends forward, and taking estimates of future climate, the optimists and the pessimists from about 3 of the major global climate models, then we see that whereas now an average summer in Chicago may have about 5 days that are above the health protective limits set by the EPA, but by the end of the century, we may get between 10 and 30 days above this health protective limit. So, summarize on the impacts, and this is sort of the depressing side of the talk, but that we are already seeing significant change, and that a future climate will bring more change. And there are agricultural vulnerabilities, there are infrastructure vulnerabilities, there's air quality vulnerabilities, but are there opportunities? And I would say yes. I think it's worth first starting out and thinking, how do we, as Americans, use our energy, and are there some things that we can learn from other countries so that we can start understanding the problem and designing solutions? And if you think about per person carbon dioxide emissions, this was in 2002, at the top of the list is the United States. So we definitely emit more carbon dioxide per person based on our lifestyle choices and our policies and our way that we've developed our towns and cities than any other country. I think that now Saudi Arabia may be equal or a little bit higher. If you look at China, China is often cited as equaling or even surpassing our national carbon dioxide emissions, but that's because there's so many more people in China than there are in the United States. If we look at it on a per-person basis, China is much, much less, a little bit over 2 tons per person, whereas we're up at 20 per person in the United States. But you can look at maybe a country that you have more personal experience with. Maybe you go there for a vacation or are studying German, or we all speak English here. That Germany and the UK, they're both emitting about half as much carbon dioxide per person. So it's not saying that we have to become a rural society or go back 40 years to be reducing our carbon dioxide. We can have a vibrant economy while still doing it in a lower carbon way. So the question is how? If we want to look at what activities are associated with these emissions, here I'm looking at nitrogen oxide emissions, not carbon dioxide, but giving you away what a lot of my work deals with. But here what we're looking at is the U.S. population, and you see if we look at nitrogen dioxide, another byproduct of fossil fuel burning, that we see major sources, major levels of emissions in highly populated regions, whether it's Southern California or the Eastern United States or the Midwest. But we also see major emissions where we have truck routes, where we have rail lines. So, trying to understand what and where is causing the emissions is a good starting point for thinking about solutions. And electricity is a major source of carbon emissions, especially here in the Midwest, where we get a large fraction of our electricity from coal. And what you're seeing here in this map is the pie chart represents the amount of total electricity generated, and where it's black, that's coming from coal. So throughout the Midwest, we get a lot of our electricity from coal, and we have a lot of electricity generation. The red is nuclear, which has certainly emerged back the public dialogue in recent weeks. But from a climate perspective, it had actually been having a resurgence in interest, even from a lot of environmental groups, because nuclear does not emit carbon dioxide through its operation. We see that in some parts of the country they can get a lot of their electricity from hydropower, especially up in the Pacific Northwest, but that's not really a big resource here in Iowa or throughout the Midwest. And so if we look at greenhouse gas emissions from electricity production, that's this lower left panel, we see that coal really is the elephant in the room in terms of carbon emissions per kilowatt hour of electricity generated. And for most of us, we really don't care where our electricity comes from, as long as when you turn on the lights or your computer, it works. And so I think thinking about the source of electricity and how to move away from these carbon-based fuels could put us at we could view it as an opportunity. And so there's the potential for the Midwest to lead global and national efforts to have lower carbon transportation, lower carbon electricity production, and leveraging electricity production from agriculture. And biogas, in particular, is a really neat opportunity to be taking farm waste, whether it's manure or crop residue, and actually getting electricity either for farm use or even to sell back to the grid. So there's a lot of ideas out there that are ways that the Midwest could potentially emerge as a leader. And I might, with all these slides, I used a different font on my Mac computer, so all of these slides don't look quite as pretty as they did on my own system. And this last one that's running off the page is reducing our vulnerability, whether it's our infrastructure, our agriculture, our waterways, and exporting the solutions that come from those vulnerability reductions. And lest you think that I am being a naive optimist, I'll just throw out a couple estimates that other researchers have done on how we can truly be solving these problems, these climate change problems. And the most widely cited framework for thinking about solutions to carbon emissions is what are called stabilization wedges. It was a framework proposed by Rob Socolow and Steve Pacala in 2005. And their mental model was to say, well, let's imagine that over the next 50 years, if we keep going as business as usual, that our emissions are going to continue to rise in a linear way. This is probably too conservative, but just to get the conversation started, it's very reasonable. So then to say, what do we have to do now, 2005, to just stabilize our emissions? Take our hand off the faucet. We still have carbon flowing into the bathtub, but we're just not cranking up the power of that emissions. And they said, well, there's no one silver bullet that can reduce these future carbon emissions. But we can break it down into bite-sized chunks, which they called stabilization wedges, and to say, and maybe we do have ways to reduce carbon in this kind of chunk-by-chunk basis. And so they said, well, if you took this way of measuring it, you'd need 7 wedges to maintain this flat path out for the next 50 years. And do we have 7 wedges that we could apply to this? And yes, in their calculations, they came up with about 16. And these fall into a number of different categories, from efficiency and conservation, whether it's reducing miles traveled so that people can walk to work more easily than driving, or having increased heating efficiency, putting storm windows on houses and better building shells on new buildings. Fuel switching, moving away from coal, which we saw was one of the most carbon-intensive energy sources, pulling in nuclear, thinking about wind and solar, and then the forest storage and the soil storage, that's that drain. That's the bathtub drain that we saw earlier. If there are ways for us to be planting trees, to be encouraging carbon uptake by soils, that this would be another way to be taking a bite out of that future carbon emissions. And since you're all a policy class, you might say, yeah, but what is the bottom line? How much is this going to cost? And of course, many of these solutions have a price tag. But based on a report done by a consulting company, McKinsey, a number of years ago, and I apologize for the sort of the bad quality of the text here, but what they did is they took a whole range of solutions to reduce carbon emissions and ranked them from negative cost solutions that pay back all the way up to the most expensive solutions. And we see, so everything on this left side of the plot, these are carbon reduction options that actually have a zero or positive or negative net cost. Some of these include building new shells for residential buildings to improve heating efficiency, or compact fluorescent lighting in commercial buildings, fuel economy improvements for cars, combined heat and power facilities. When you're building a power plant, make it a heating plant as well. Conservation tillage, better agricultural practices to keep carbon in the soil. So we see that there are win-win opportunities, not just win opportunities for carbon, but even win-win opportunities that pay themselves back. And then depending on how much we want to be investing in our solution portfolio, we can move toward onshore wind, carbon capture and storage, better heating and AC equipment for buildings, and a wide range of other winter cover crops, a range of solutions that cut across electricity, transportation, agriculture, and those are the 3 areas. So one of these solutions that's come up in a few different contexts is biofuels. And here, in the breadbasket of America, it's no surprise that many states and many industries and many farmers have been very excited about the opportunity for biofuels to be meeting this new interest in low carbon energy sources, and thinking about sustainability as an opportunity for the Midwest. So the reason why there is all this interest in biofuels spans a few different issues. One is that they are renewable. These whereas when you take oil out of the ground, there's just less and less and less of it. Whereas these biofuel crops grow back year after year. Carbon neutral, this idea that as the plants grow, they take carbon out of the atmosphere, and then as you burn them, they release it back to the atmosphere. So it's a potential for a closed-loop system. Each of these little asterisks is indicating that it's not quite that simple. And superior emissions characteristics, not just for carbon dioxide, but for all the other pollutants that come out of a tailpipe. Are there ways for switching to biofuels to be win-win, to have healthier air, and have lower carbon emissions? Then there's also support for domestic agriculture, reduced dependence on foreign oil, and that it uses existing engines and infrastructures. And all of those last three really have no caveats. Those are true. So over the past few years, with this expanded interest and enthusiasm and development of a biofuels market, there's also been a lot of controversy around biofuels, and most of that has related to the sustainability of biofuels. And it's often been framed as a real black and white issue: promise or peril, savior or culprit, fuels or food, forests or fuel, fuel or cheap food. And this is not a simple black and white issue. There are definitely petroleum supply concerns, with estimates of supply falling, and these are oil discovery estimates from ExxonMobil, so right from the source, increasing demand worldwide, and that's driven both by the increasing population and the greater standard of living of developing countries. The supply falling, national security concerns that where this oil is located tends to be especially in the Middle East, so there's a lot of geopolitical concerns, and global climate change, which we've just spent the last half hour or so discussing. So with all of these things together, is it the right time for biofuels? Well, the good news is that there are hundreds of different feedstocks that can be used for. Basically, when thinking about biofuels, there's two main classes, and that's biodiesel, that would replace diesel fuel. And actually, worldwide, more diesel is used than gasoline, and in many parts of the world, diesel is used for electricity generation, not just transportation. Here in the United States, we use most diesel for heavy-duty trucking and freight transport. So there's a lot of different feedstocks that can be used to make biodiesel, and they range in yield, and these are some common yields. Actually, one of my former students, Matt Johnston, he did a global inventory of different yields. So these are just simple numbers that are often thrown around, but the soybean yields about 48 gallons of biodiesel per acre. So even though when people in the United States are talking about biodiesel, it's often around soy, this is actually one of the lowest yielding biodiesel feedstocks. And they go all the way up to algae, which could potentially yield 4,000 gallons of biodiesel per acre. But to date, there hasn't been a commercially viable, sustainable algae production system, in part because invasive species that fly in through the atmosphere get into the algae production system, and the low yield algae overtakes the high yield algae. But it's nice to know we have different options, different products, but different ones of these biodiesel feedstocks are also grown in different parts in the world. And as we see, aside from algae, oil, palm, and coconut are two of the highest yielding sources of biodiesel supply, and as we know that those do not grow here in Iowa. Ethanol, there's fewer feedstocks that can go into making ethanol production. Today, most is made with corn, and that's where Iowa plays, and the rest of the Midwest plays a leading role, as well as sugarcane. And the yields here are quite different. Sugarcane has about double or triple the yield per acre of ethanol than does corn. But again, it's not well suited for our climate here. So, one issue that's come out when thinking about corn agriculture is that because it is very resource intensive, we suddenly have an issue where something that may have started out as a climate issue, carbon in the atmosphere, becomes an energy issue. Hey, let's use biofuels. And then becomes an agricultural issue, which feedstock is going to produce those biofuels. And then becomes a water quality issue, as you have more fertilizers that are used to create those biofuels, and then those run off into, in our area, the Mississippi River. And then flow down and create a zone in the Gulf of Mexico that does not have enough oxygen for animals and plants to survive, so it's called the dead zone. So here we have, in my opinion, kind of one of the classic sustainability examples, something that is not, it started out climate, but then cut across all the way down through water, air, and biodiversity. So one of the biggest issues that's come up in the context of biofuels has nothing to do with the Midwest at all, or so it seems, which is tropical land use. And this question, there's two broad issues when it comes to land use. One is what's called direct land use, that if you chop down a rainforest and use it to grow oil palm, that sure you're going to be getting this high yield of biodiesel, but there was a lot of carbon that had been stored in that forest, in that soil, not to mention the animals that live there, the unique plant species. And so by cutting that down, even ignoring the animals and the biodiversity, we still are at a net loss for carbon. That if we cut down a carbon-rich rainforest and replace it with a biofuel motivated by climate and carbon concerns, then we may end up being a net loser. And the question is, how much of a net loser will we be? Well, this was some work that I contributed to with a team led by Holly Gibbs and my former PhD student Matt Johnston, where we looked at a few different feedstocks, both for ethanol and for biodiesel, and a number of different types of tropical lands, and calculated the payback time. And this is basically how many years would you have to be using this bio-based fuel to have a net carbon win after you take into account all the carbon that was lost from the initial transfer of the land to agricultural production. And so if we look at, for each of these, and I'll just take oil palm going across, that if we grow oil palm on degraded land or grassland or shrubland, that actually you're going to make that carbon savings back maybe in a single year. So that's actually a pretty good idea if you want to be thinking about where to be expanding biofuel production in the tropics, that there are some options where oil palm may be a win. But if you start moving oil palm onto shrubland or degraded forests or intact forests, it may be taking 100 years or more to be paying that back. So it's probably not a good policy option. And if we start thinking about less productive feedstocks like soybean, and if we're growing those on forested area, that it may take over 1,000 years for the payback. So again, this thinking through what's the purpose, what are the links, and what are some unintended consequences? Like how might deforestation actually undo the carbon goals of a biofuel policy? And actually, Holly Gibbs, who is the lead author here, she's been the lead consultant on land use for the California Air Resources Board as they design their low-carbon policy. So that's this idea of direct land use. But the more controversial part of this issue is what's called indirect land use. And you might say, okay, we're not going to, we see the results, we're responsible policymakers, we're not going to cut down forests to be growing soybean or oil palm. But if here in the Midwest we start growing more soybeans for biofuel production, someplace in the world is going to be meeting that gap in the market by growing soybeans for food production, or by growing corn. If more of our corn goes toward ethanol, someplace in the world is going to be responding to that market demand for corn by growing more. And in many parts of the world, the cheapest, easiest way to be expanding production is to be moving into some of these otherwise natural forested areas. So this idea of how do decisions that are being made here in the Midwest around biofuels or agriculture more generally affect global deforestation and the global carbon balance is really a very widely discussed, hotly contested policy issue. This is just that point that I made. This is some work by a colleague of mine at SAGE, Chris Kucharek, but they were looking at different scenarios of fertilizer use to support corn ethanol production. And what does that mean for the Gulf of Mexico? And basically finding that under any of the ethanol production targets, there would be too much fertilizer flowing into the Gulf of Mexico to meet some of the targets to reduce that dead zone. I'm going to skip over this and just start wrapping up so that we have plenty of time for discussion and questions. And, pulling this all back to what does sustainability mean for policy? What does it mean for the Midwest? And in my view, the real issue, the key is that issues need to be considered as part of a system. And that is a very different way of thinking about environmental regulation than anything that we've been doing here in the United States to date. A broader global perspective is needed. We can't just look at things on a city-by-city or state-by-state basis. Decisions that are being made in the Midwest affect everything from global climate to tropical deforestation, and the list could go on much longer. These opportunities and vulnerabilities connect human activities and natural resources. So it's not just a doom and gloom story, that wherever you see a problem, there's the potential to solve it. And so I think thinking about these problems, not just as interesting things that we can't do anything about, but actually where are the solutions? And I truly believe there are solutions, but unfortunately the timescales of the natural system don't match up with timescales of political systems. Here I was saying that these carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere stays in the atmosphere for over 200 years. Well, that's way beyond the timescale that elected politicians are thinking through. So the question that I really leave you with is, how do you want to solve this grand challenge? And it's not just climate and it's not just deforestation, but it is how all of these different systems work together to maintain a human health and well-being with a global population and one Earth. So I'll end there.